Angry piss. I've had one of those once. Come on, Gerard. It's today. We're doing this today. I'm not waiting any longer. I've had enough of this shit. Right. No more prison for George. No more. No more. Oh, bloody weep lapatootie.
Oh, you get back here.
I'm
gonna kill ya.
You're squishing my pancreas!
I'm gonna get fired if I let another one escape.
I've never liked ladders, they look at me funny.
Oh, I don't get paid enough for this.
Bloody pickaxe don't want it anyway. Bubonic plague! Weep lapatootie. Is that Belgium? What the fuck is that? What in the name of bloody trees is that? What the bloody hell is this? Is this Belgium? Could be Belgium. What the bloody hell? Is this the bloody Indian shop that my mum always used to go to? Smells a bit off. Why is it so much bigger than it used to be? Is that the tickle pickle? Bleeding hell. It's Mr. Creaky Clockers. That's all sing Botham. Still food in there. I don't know why I like to plant food in there. It's a bit odd. Oh, guy number 2. No, but seriously, what the hell is happening here? I must leave. Lots of beer. This looks a bit bloody bigger than usual. Phil! Phil, are you in here, Phil? Is Sandra stuck in the ceiling again? There's wood on the floor still. That's a good sign. Well, last time, from what I remember, we didn't have a blender! Phil's not here either. Bloody Phil and his bloody hat and the bloody thing and the bloody Phil and the bloody hat. Oh, Sandra's not in the ceiling either. That's a good sign. The bloody hell is this place? Is that the sun? Don't think so. Looks like the moon to me. Is that a mushroom? Doesn't look like a mushroom. Smells like a plant made of orange. Is that the bloody dog I found? I need me some dogs right now. Well, that's just made my day worse. I recognise this place. George! Light. Stupid crack whore.
Have you ever had back pain?
Ay, 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 ay.